that we're holding this press conference in the Westminster Village, because this is all about taking our campaign outside Westminster and taking it out into the country. Back in July, the last time we met here, we spoke about getting cracking, getting moving, not waiting for the Prime Minister's so-called renegotiation. We wanted to get out there. We wanted to convince people just why it would be better for this country to leave the European Union. We want to hold a series of meetings around the country, meet normal folk, tell them about the democratic deficit that exists, the fact that the majority of our laws are now made in Brussels, not by MEPs, but by a faceless, unelected, bureaucratic European Commission that meets in secret. We want to tell them about the fact that it's costing the British people £55 million every single day to be members of this club. Yes, we get half back, but then we are forced to put up signs around the country on building projects saying, "Thank EU, this project was built with European money." There is no such thing as European money. It's our own money which goes out there, we get half back, and they then tell us how we must spend our own cash. We want to tell people that being members of this club forces up energy prices, forces up the price of food. It makes poor people poorer and rich people richer. It also affects our trade, an inability to trade. We don't have a seat on the World Trade Organization anymore. The European Union signs trade deals on our behalf. We want to see a Britain which is confident, which isn't inward-looking, which looks to the future, which can trade with the rest of the globe once again. And of course, we will tackle the thorny issue of immigration. We will tell people that being members of this club with freedom of movement of peoples forces down the wages of working people across this country. And we will say, wouldn't it be better if we had an Australian points-based system whereby we could say, if you've got the skills that this country needs, yes, please come here and work. We've got meetings booked right across the country, from Margate to Leeds to Chester. And the man I'm going to introduce now is the man who I believe has forced the issue over a number of years. Forced it so much that a British Prime Minister had to give a commitment for a referendum that he never wanted to give. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce that man. He's the leader of UKIP. He's the co-president of the EFDD group in the European Parliament, Mr. Nigel Farage.
Well, good morning, everybody. I stood here just over a month ago and said that I thought the No campaign in this forthcoming referendum were guilty of sitting on their hands, that there were far too many people who were saying, let's wait until the Prime Minister comes back, let's give the Prime Minister the benefit of the doubt in those renegotiations, and that actually that policy was flawed. Flawed because, if you actually look at what Mr. Cameron is trying to renegotiate, it is modest to say the least, and you never know, we may hear more about Mr. Cameron's plans, because I was at a meeting yesterday of the Conference of Presidents of the European Parliament, and Martin Schulz, its president, is now offering Mr. Cameron the opportunity to come and address the European Parliament. So I hope he takes up that offer, and you never know, we might find out more. But my other reason for being a bit critical of some of those who may potentially be on the no side, be on the let's leave the European Union side, is that the yes side have not been sparing the horses. Barely a week goes by when we don't see on our television screens Tony Blair or Richard Branson or Lord Mandelson telling us that not only should we vote to stay members of the European Union, but that at the right time, joining the euro would be a tremendously good idea. So I promised back then that while at the moment we had two groups that were bidding to be the official No campaign, I thought it was incumbent upon us, as the only Eurosceptic organisation in Britain that does have tens of thousands of members, that does have a branch structure around the country, incumbent upon us to actually do something. And that is what today is all about. The campaign for Britain to leave the European Union has started today in this hall, and it's a campaign that if we get it right, we can win. We are launching the biggest outreach campaign in the history of the Eurosceptic movement, certainly the biggest campaign that's been seen in Britain since 1975. We have appointed, for every region of the United Kingdom, a referendum coordinator. We have 12 of those in place. And we're conscious, very conscious, that to win this referendum, we have to get outside, and the arguments have to get outside the confines of Westminster. We've got to go out and reach real people and reach ordinary voters. And so to that end, we have 300 public meetings planned already. Everything from village halls and working man's clubs up to big arenas like the Sage Theatre in Gateshead. Our biggest meetings will all be live streamed, as indeed is this press conference, as we attempt to reach as big an audience as we possibly can. And yes, we're doing the old-fashioned thing of putting leaflets through doors. And since I was here a month ago, we've distributed 3 million leaflets to go through doors to our activists, and we anticipate printing and distributing at least 3 million more between now and Christmas. And the UKIP membership base is active and is engaged. And I'm very proud of the fact that the Electoral Commission, in their submission, where they explained why the referendum question had changed, said that one of the reasons for that was that 1,000 UKIP members had written to the Electoral Commission complaining about the bias of the question and how wrong it was for one side to claim the positive yes and the other to be seen with a negative no. So UKIP is stepping up to the plate. And I'm very pleased to see that question has changed. It seems to me that Cameron's attempted stitch-up is beginning to unravel. And perhaps we're about to see him make some big concessions on the Purdah period too. Now, I do believe that we can win this referendum. And for those that have suggested or said over the course of this week that UKIP is going it alone and UKIP doesn't want to reach out and work with other people, I'm sorry, that's wrong. We will work with anybody. We will share platforms with anybody. We will do whatever it takes. We want our country back. We don't want to stay members of the European Union. And we recognise and understand that we won't win this referendum unless we get significant numbers of people from the centre-left of politics to vote to leave the EU as well. There's been this extraordinary myth in the last few years that somehow Euroscepticism is to do with people who are on the centre-right. Historically, of course, that simply isn't the case. It was the Labour Party, it was senior Labour politicians who were the biggest advocates of voting no all the way back in 1975. And I do see some genuine hope and optimism in the centre-left of British politics from our perspective. The debate had all but been closed down since Delors made that speech all those years ago in Bournemouth. But suddenly we've seen, firstly, with the proposed transatlantic trade treaty, suddenly we've seen huge numbers of people, traditionally Labour supporters, perhaps Green supporters, perhaps people who didn't have a party left-wing enough to vote for. That's about to change, isn't it? But we saw as MEPs, we saw more emails, more letters, and received more phone calls over people's concern as to what the corporate stitch-up that TTIP represents would do than we've seen over any issue since I've been there since 1999. And indeed, I believe that a Corbyn victory is a good result. Now, when I look through the list of his policies and various people that he might call friends, might have shared platforms with over the decades, I don't really find myself in agreement with anything with Jeremy Corbyn. However, under his leadership, which now looks all but certain, I am absolutely confident that there is going to be a proper debate about the European Union that goes on within the centre-left of British politics. And indeed, it was quite instructive last night on the Sky News debate that when the EU question came up, and when Jeremy Corbyn quite rightly said the way that the Greeks had been treated by the Troika and the EU institutions was absolutely disgraceful and was just down-treading democracy, he got from that audience of Labour supporters one of the biggest cheers of the evening. So, as far as this referendum is concerned, I welcome a Corbyn victory. And yes, even though we disagree on almost everything, I'd love to share a platform with him in the run-up to this referendum. So we will do whatever it takes to try and get the right result. We want to leave the EU. We see there's nothing to fear. We understand that, of course, this is about governing our own country. Of course, it's about our own Parliament and our own Supreme Court being, as it says, supreme. We also understand that there is genuine concern in this country that we're shoveling £55 million a day into a club whose accounts have not been properly signed off for the last 19 years in a row. But I think it is almost certain that the issue of immigration, the issue of open borders, the question of why we are borderless Britain, I think will dominate this referendum campaign and indeed the result. And it's very interesting, if you look at what's happened since the last general election, by 14%, there's been a rise in those who say that immigration is their number one concern in Britain today. The last big poll on this, 50% of people said immigration was their number one concern, with the economy trailing behind as the second most important factor at 27%. Now, I know that the debate about open borders into Britain, the debate about wage compression, the debate about the lack of primary school facilities, the pressure on the health service, the change in many of our communities, I know we've talked a lot about that over the course of the last few years, and so much so that far from this being seen to be a toxic issue in British politics, actually about 75% of people want us to have border controls so that we can decide who comes into Britain. And whenever we talk about an Australian-style point system, virtually everybody agrees that it's the right, pragmatic and sensible thing to do. But the immigration debate is perhaps not focused on those issues right at this moment in time. It's focused, and indeed been brought into very sharp focus, by a photograph. That photograph of the dead 3-year-old boy, which I think has touched everybody in this country, in Europe, and across many, many parts of the world. And I think the question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we prevent more appalling photographs like that? How do we prevent things like the 71 people who were found dead in the back of that truck in Austria the other day? Now, in April, I went to Strasbourg to take part in a debate on the Mediterranean crisis with Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker. That debate took place just 9 days before the British general election. I said that I felt that the European Union had made a catastrophic error. It had done it in implementing the EU's common asylum policy, which had set the terms for who can qualify for asylum so widely that it even, to quote Jean-Claude Juncker himself, included people who come from extreme poverty. He also made it very clear in April that absolutely anyone that put one foot on EU soil would be allowed to stay. And I said it seemed to me that that would lead to an exodus of biblical proportions. I regret to say that my predictions of this and my attempt to make this a genuine debate in the general election failed totally. In fact, some media organisations said that I'd taken a break from the general election campaign to go to Strasbourg, as if I was a day tripper or something like that. I also felt back in April that the main beneficiaries of this would be the criminal gangs, many of them, of course, run by ISIS. That problem, ladies and gentlemen, has been compounded this week by the words of Chancellor Merkel. I guess she had no choice but to say what she did, because as members of Schengen, Germany has already been the magnet this year and will continue to be for very, very large numbers of people. But what she has done is she has made the incentive for people, through whatever means, to try and get to the EU even stronger. And I think those photographs of people at the train station in Hungary chanting, "Germany, Germany," says to you that there is actually a real risk. In fact, some of the scenes that we saw in Hungary yesterday looked to me as if it was beginning to become a stampede. It is indeed a very dangerous thing, I think, that she's done. And I have to say that given that Europe, and Germany in particular, has now given huge incentives for people to come to the European Union by whatever means, I'm sorry to say that I think the shocking image that we saw of that young boy and the deaths in those lorries actually become more likely and not less likely. The only way to stop the deaths is to stop the boats from coming. And there is very recent historical precedent for that, because in 2008, Australia faced a very similar crisis. Boatloads of people coming on even longer sea journeys than they are across the Mediterranean, boats sinking, people drowning. And Australia stopped it by saying, if you want to come to Australia, you will not come by these means. The Australians did it. The Australians stopped the drownings and that tide of misery. And indeed, Tony Abbott has offered the European Union help and advice in terms of the way that Australia dealt with their crisis. And I have to say that that advice has been spurned. And I also think we need to have a more open and honest debate about who are the people that are coming. You know, when I sat in that meeting yesterday with President Schulz of the European Parliament, he kept using the word refugee. And indeed, in many of the news reports in Britain, I keep hearing the word refugee, albeit interspersed with the word migrant. I think at times we're not quite sure what we're actually talking about. A refugee is, by definition, from the United Nations, an individual with a well-founded fear of persecution, usually for reasons of race, class, religion, or sexual orientation. And I have to say that whilst we focus today on the Syrian problem, actually, most of the people that have come over the course of the last year across the Mediterranean have come from countries like Somalia, Mali, Nigeria, Mauritania, and the vast majority of those that have come have been, and this is unavoidable, have been young males. And whilst conditions in some of those countries may not be very nice, it is incredibly difficult to see how more than a few of those people would qualify as genuine refugees. Indeed, the Slovakian Prime Minister, Robert Fico, said this week, EU leaders are not telling the truth about the backgrounds of the majority of people. 95% are economic migrants. And I noticed yesterday the Hungarian MEP and Monet professor and great proponent of all things EU, Chopin, and very moderate conservative, said that he'd noticed that the migrants that were travelling through Hungary were in many cases wealthier than the people that actually lived in rural Hungary. So the EU, seems to me, has got this wrong. Anybody that comes from whatever background and virtually for whatever reason can claim to be a refugee. And I would have thought that if the European Union wants to help genuine refugees, they need to establish offshore centres and process people correctly rather than inviting what has now turned into a headlong rush. And there is a further element to this that I think is even more sinister and even more dangerous. When ISIS say they will use the migrant tide to flood Europe with 500,000 of their own jihadists, I think we'd better listen. 500,000 may not be realistic, but what if it's 5,000? What if it's 500? And already one of the ISIS terrorist suspects who committed the first atrocity against holidaymakers in Tunisia has been seen getting off a boat onto Italian soil. At the moment, the European Union's common asylum policy has absolutely no means whatsoever of checking anybody's background. And I would say that we must not allow our compassion to imperil our safety. Now, I do believe myself this EU crisis was very easy to predict, and I think the continual policy failures mean the situation is likely, I'm afraid, to get worse and not better. But what about the United Kingdom? Well, I'm very pleased to say that we didn't just opt out of the euro, we opted out of Schengen. Thank goodness we did. And I'm also pleased to say that we opted out of the European Union's common asylum policy. But that, of course, does not make us immune from the failure of EU policy. And you only have to look, of course, at Calais and the summer of total disruption in Kent to understand the problem. We also, of course, face the risk that at some point, whether it's in Italy or a Greece or a Hungary, but at some point, somebody gets so tired of what is going on and realizes that the burden-sharing plan within the common asylum policy isn't working, that, of course, all they have to do is to issue people with EU passports, and then, of course, they would be free to travel to the United Kingdom. So we're not immune from it in any way. We're not isolated from it in any way. And the cries today, of course, over the last 48 hours, since that horrible, depressing, saddening picture, have been, well, how many do you think Britain should take? Well, of course, the answer is, ladies and gentlemen, that last year we took 640,000 people. 640,000 people came here through borderless Britain, chiefly as a result of our EU membership. And a huge number of those who came last year were, by definition, relatively poor people who were economic migrants. And we do take refugees. There's a sort of myth that Britain doesn't take refugees. We do take refugees. We take refugees every year. About 4% of last year's total were refugees. As an average over the last few years, around about 25,000 to 30,000 people come to Britain as refugees every single year. And let me be clear, there have been a lot of things that have been said over the course of the last couple of years about UKIP and what it stands for. A lot of attempts to demonize UKIP in the eyes of the public. But ever since the inception of this party, UKIP has always believed that the United Kingdom is a country with a fine record of helping people and helping genuine refugees. And we've always stood by that. And I was, if you remember, in 2013, the first party leader in Britain to suggest that we should offer some refugee places to a few thousand people from Syria. I was the first person to even begin talking about that. Perhaps that's no surprise. After all, my predecessors were French Protestants who came to Britain in the 18th century. So I don't think, given that already we have about 25,000 people a year coming here as refugees, there is any difficulty in a few thousand of those being from Syria. I don't see that as an issue. But what I do see as an issue is we must absolutely make sure that we do nothing to encourage people to seek refugee status in this country who've come across the Mediterranean. We've got to start discouraging people coming to Europe by those means if we're serious about stopping the deaths. And of course, the vast majority of the British population are concerned, not just about this issue, but they're concerned about the lack of border controls in this country. And if we win this referendum, we will then and only then be in a position where we can put in place a skills-based immigration policy that doesn't discriminate against the rest of the world in favour of members of the European Union. And we'll be able then to put in place an Australian-style point system. We'll be able then to drastically reduce the levels of net migration into Britain. And once we do that, we'll be freer and more willing to fulfil our traditional role of helping those in genuine need. Thank you very much.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.